The Great Gatsby clocks in at about 47,000 words, or in this edition, 174 pages. One of the main reasons The Great Gatsby is so popular is because it is so short. You can learn a lot about what can be accomplished through literary devices by studying this novel. The Great Gatsby is one of the most approachable American novels of all time because of its length. You can sit down and read it in one day if you put your mind to it, though it's not recommended. The prose in this novel is dense enough and beautiful enough that you really should take your time with it. Probably the best way to approach the novel, if you have the time to do so and aren't up against some sort of essay-related deadline, is to read one chapter per day. This novel is one of the few great novels written in the first person. The main character, Nick Carraway, who in many ways parallels the life of F. Scott Fitzgerald, brings a perspective to this story that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten if it had been, say, close person third on any of the other characters in the story. Nick Carraway's interiority is the most interesting part of the novel, and that is why it is told from his perspective. Though Gatsby himself receives a lot of the attention in the novel and is the titular character, it's really Nick Carraway's relationships with Daisy, Gatsby, and others in the novel that brings out the best literary substance and gives the novel its depth. Most of the other characters exist very solidly within worlds of their own, and this makes them somewhat unlikable. Daisy has a lot of attributes that come across as abrasive and negative, but really she's a reflection of our shortcomings in many ways. Out of all of the main characters, Tom Buchanan typically gets the least amount of shine because he's not a love interest. The novel is not named after him, and he's not narrating the story, but it is his character in juxtaposition with the others that accentuates a lot of the positive and negative qualities of these other people. Tom Buchanan, in general, is not overly likable. He's physically intimidating, has a lot of money, is pretty aloof, and doesn't have many cares in the world. The destruction that he leaves behind him doesn't seem to bother him. In fact, he's so aloof that by the end of the novel, when you realize that Tom and Daisy have been unfaithful to each other for probably quite some time, he maintains that they're still deeply in love with one another. In many ways, he represents the real limit of the American dream, which in many ways is what this novel is about. I believe the original title was supposed to be something like Underneath the Red, White, and Blue, which I'm glad that The Great Gatsby ended up being the title, but I think that gives you some pretty good insight as to what F. Scott Fitzgerald was trying to get at with this novel. Gatsby, in many ways, is trying to become the absolute best version of himself, leans so far into the American dream that he transcends what most of us think is possible, and ultimately this results in his demise. There are many famous quotes, passages, and images throughout this novel because, again, it is one of the most teachable novels ever written. You can easily understand it when you're in high school, probably in middle school as well. Quotes that are often cited are the one at the very end. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And the image of the green light that Gatsby sees, and also that he believes in. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning. But it's important to keep in mind that these famous quotes are merely the prosaic heights of the novel. The narration throughout is of exceptional quality, and really it's the dialogue that carries this story forward. Most of the chapters in the story are driven almost entirely by dialogue, and this dialogue showcases character in mostly implicit ways. Often what a character is saying is not what they actually mean, and in this way, the book is very similar to Mad Men, or rather, I should say Mad Men is very similar to this book when it comes to the scene composition and the dialogue. I believe that the narration is able to be this beautiful and this good because The Great Gatsby draws a lot of its substance from F. Scott Fitzgerald's own life. Consider the character of Daisy Buchanan and the similarities between her and Zelda Fitzgerald, F. Scott's wife. Consider the similarities between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Nick Carraway, the narrator. Both come from the Midwest, move out to the East, and Nick Carraway moves away after the events of the novel and is left to reflect upon what they mean and what the eventual ends of the characters in the book means in the context of America and American life. In this way, Nick Carraway is inclined to perceive the world in almost exactly the same ways as F. Scott Fitzgerald is. Carraway is a novelist. Many have tried to imitate what F. Scott Fitzgerald was able to accomplish with The Great Gatsby, write a short novel that is beautifully written and says a lot about the current state of America. But the reason why these other novels have not lived up to the standards set by The Great Gatsby is in large part because of the era that The Great Gatsby is set in. America in the 1920s was at the height of excess and would soon experience one of its greatest falls in the 1930s. And so the 20s are perhaps the best time to set a novel if what you're trying to explore is what are the eventual ends of the American dream? How high can someone rise, and what does that person have to look like? And furthermore, what will the lived experience of a person who can rise to the very top actually be? Again, consider the character of Tom Buchanan and the hollowness that's at the center of his life. The extent to which he is aware of the lack of meaning at the center of his life is a little unclear. He clearly doesn't have any physical needs that are unmet and is living the lifestyle that he would like to live. But he doesn't have true love, or is at least unhappy in his marriage, and his wife is unhappy as well. One of the primary reasons that Nick Carraway is such a good narrator in this novel is because he is in New York to pursue some sort of career, perhaps ascend in the ranks of the Bond business, and is a lot closer to the everyman, people like us, than someone like Tom Buchanan. Carraway is also designed to be the optimal narrator. He's pretty open-minded. He talks in the scenes, but not a lot, and is mainly listening and observing. And this, from a craft perspective, is a really excellent move on F. Scott Fitzgerald's part, because it allows him to get away with certain flourishes that he wouldn't be able to if the character of his narrator were set up differently. In fact, Nick Carraway's perspective on scenes is often so good and so open-minded that it's pretty clear that we're just getting narration from F. Scott Fitzgerald at certain points in the novel, that we are transcending what Nick Carraway would realistically bring to the table, and we're getting sentences that only F. Scott Fitzgerald could have written. Another favor that F. Scott Fitzgerald does himself is that he sets the story in New York City, which in many ways represents the heights of American capitalism and the heights of what was going on in the 1920s. My favorite flourish of F. Scott Fitzgerald's comes at the very end of the first chapter, when Nick Carraway is observing Gatsby from afar. The quote reads, "Involuntarily I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been the end of a dock. When I looked once more for Gatsby, he had vanished, and I was alone again in the unquiet darkness." When you read The Great Gatsby, be on the lookout for how efficient some of the sentences are, especially towards the beginning of chapters and in transitions. Oftentimes, the amount of work that Fitzgerald was able to accomplish with one single sentence would have looked like a couple of paragraphs in a novel written by a less capable writer. And it is this ability to add so much to the story and progress it so far forward without rushing it in such a short span of words that makes this novel so short. Nothing in terms of substance is skipped out on, and instead we are left with one of the most poetic and elegantly crafted novels of all time. Of course, this would go on to haunt Fitzgerald, as he really wasn't able to replicate what he was able to accomplish here in The Great Gatsby. And of course, the effects of that were compounded by how difficult it was to live with Zelda Fitzgerald. The life of F. Scott Fitzgerald is illuminated quite a bit in A Movable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. So if you're a really big fan of The Great Gatsby, or find that you would like to know more about Fitzgerald after reading it, A Movable Feast is the next book that you should move on to. It's only about 40,000 words, and it's Hemingway, so you're going to get a lot of quality substance there. Hemingway goes so far as to write entire chapters about F. Scott Fitzgerald, his relationship with Fitzgerald. And he explores the roots of Fitzgerald's insecurities. Similar to Carraway's perspective on the events of The Great Gatsby, he's reflecting on what happened after the fact. Hemingway, in A Movable Feast, reflects on F. Scott Fitzgerald's life in Hemingway's later years. Fitzgerald has already died by the time A Movable Feast is being published. And I would add that it's impossible to get a full understanding of The Great Gatsby without studying who F. Scott Fitzgerald was as a person and getting to know as much about his life as possible, because of how closely his life and his perspective is mirrored by Nick Carraway and the subject matter of the story. Whether you're new to American literature, have to read this to write some sort of paper, or are very familiar with the novel already, I hope that you learned something, got a little something out of this video. There are already quite a few in-depth summaries out there on the internet if that's what you're looking for, but I wanted to give my 2 cents on the novel, and in particular, what I think makes it so great, why I think it stood the test of time. It still sells about 500,000 copies a year, and when it first came out, it really wasn't that popular. And again, the reason for this is because schools buy this novel in bulk all the time. Why? It's really teachable. If you want to learn about pretty much any literary device, you'll be able to find some great examples here in this novel. But the point of reading it is not to be able to correctly identify a literary device on a multiple choice test. The real reason to read it is to think about America, think about what we're doing here in this great freedom-based experiment, and hopefully improve your own perspective in the process. Happy reading. I hope you enjoyed the novel. If you got something out of this video, consider subscribing, and if you're already subscribed, consider clicking that bell icon so that you can be notified when new videos are released.